In a stunning shakeup that reportedly even surprised some ministers, Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev and his entire government resigned last week. That came on the heels of Russian President Vladimir Putin's annual address to the nation, in which he called for the first major constitutional changes since 1993. Following the mass resignations, Russia's lower house of parliament, the State Duma, approved Putin's choice of Mikhail Mishustin as the new prime minister. So what's behind the overhaul of Russia's government? What does it mean for Putin's future? And how will it influence Russia's role in international affairs? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined in our studio here in Beijing by Anna Tangen, current affairs commentator, from Moscow by Pavel Falkenhor, a Russian defense analyst, and from Melbourne by Fraser Cameron, director of the EU Asia Center in Brussels. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. So Anna, were you surprised by the dramatic resignation of the entire government of Medvedev?
Well, I would be lying if I said no. Obviously, the entire world was shocked by this. I didn't actually believe it. I thought there was something more behind it. But when you start looking at it, it makes a lot of sense. Putin was facing a downward slope in his polls. Numbers were getting lower. There was a lot of unhappiness with the government, especially over some plans to change the way that the Social Security net was being applied, increasing ages for people who are retiring. So I think he's decided, he's a man of action. I think he's decided that he was going to be proactive, that he was going to put in place a plan that would allow him to stay, but not take so much direct responsibility for what was going to happen in the government.
Are you suggesting that Medvedev has been singled out as a scapegoat? Someone got to take the blame.
Well, as Medvedev said quite famously when they were having breakfast one day and he was the prime minister but got up and paid for the meal when Putin walked out, that's what I do.
Let me cross over to Pavel. What was the immediate response from the local Russian media towards the resignation of Medvedev's entire cabinet?
Well, the resignation of the cabinet is more of a technicality because, of course, President Putin can fire and replace any minister as he pleases, but to change the prime minister, he has to call in a resignation of the entire cabinet. No one right now in Moscow expects that there will be that much changes actually in the cabinet. So many ministers will retain their positions. There will be some kind of rotation, some going out, say back to the Kremlin administration, someone from the Kremlin administration going into government. But basically this was a change of prime minister. And that's, of course, very important because the prime minister in Russia is an important position in the day-to-day running of the country, its social, financial system. And also, of course, he is basically he's the vice president. If something happens to the president or he resigns, then the prime minister becomes automatically acting president and then could be elected as a president, as it happened with Putin when his predecessor, President Yeltsin, resigned. So this is, of course, an important change. And this is not the first time Putin changes his prime ministers, and this is not the first time. This is unexpected. Putin traditionally keeps his cards close to chest, and no one was really knew for sure. And when it's going to happen, it's understood that most likely Medvedev would be replaced, but when it would happen, no one knew. So, and the ministers quite often in Russia find out that they've been fired from the journalist asking them the question about how they comment their resignation.
It doesn't come as a major surprise if we review history of changing prime ministers since the end of the Cold War under the Boris Yeltsin administration. Let me cross over to Fraser Cameron. Do you think the resignation of Medvedev is more of a show of political theater on the stage of the Russian domestic politics, or does it serve as a shot in the arm to show up the lackluster economic performance of the Russian Federation? What's your take, Fraser?
It's probably a bit of both. I think Putin traditionally gets rid of the prime minister when things are not doing too well economically. gives the blame on the Prime Minister, brings a new guy in and hopes that this will give the administration a new lease of life. At the same time, it shows people that he's still in charge. So I think, it serves Putin quite well to bring about this change at the present time.
20 years ago, in his very first speech of inauguration, he said, give me 20 years, I'll give you an entirely different Russia back. Has he somehow realized his mandate? Has the mandate been translated into action, reality on the ground? Fraser?
I think that history will show a mixed picture. He certainly brought stability to Russia. He certainly put Russia back on the world stage. But at the same time, I think the biggest failure in an era of high oil prices was really that he did not transform the economy. Russia still is very dependent on the energy sector. Who wants to buy a Russian television, a Russian computer, a Russian car? Nobody. So, I think Russia really has not transformed its economy into a society where young Russians see their future. There are so many young Russians who want to leave Russia, unfortunately, and I think that will probably be his biggest failure. He's not really transformed the economy, established the rule of law, and made it a really interesting place for young Russians to stay and pursue a career.
A question for both of you, Pavel and Fraser. Among the three issues, which one would be the first in the pecking order? Excessive reliance on energy and the gas, that's what we call the resource curse. Economic sanctions since Crimea, or rampant corruption. Pavel, first of all, your thoughts.
Well, the problem, of course, for the Russian economy is that it has been stagnating for more than 6 years. There has been growing social tension because household incomes have been decreasing, not dramatically, but still not growing for sure, and actually decreasing, and this is creating, again, a lot of social tension that can translate into political tension. There has been, of course, for Western sanctions. The Kremlin, Moscow has been saying that these sanctions are actually good, that it allows Russia to develop industries that would have been swamped by imports if not the sanctions regime. But that's not really happening. And that means kickstarting the economy has been a major priority, and that's what Putin has been talking about. The Medvedev government has apparently failed to make the economy restart again. There's a low inflation, but that just also reflects the stagnation of the economy. And so there's a new technocrat as prime minister who has to oversee more spending and see that this does not lead to deficits or financial instability. So that's a very practical problem that Putin is trying to address by changes in the way that the economic, financial, social systems of Russia run through its government. So this is what he's doing is pragmatic things primarily.
Fraser, any of your points to add to the analysis of Pavel? Yes, go ahead.
Well, I think Pavel's absolutely right. I mean, it's a very difficult situation for Putin. There's growing social unrest. He's not providing the jobs for young people that they want. And I think that the standard of living is stagnating. And so how does he get out of this situation? Well, changing the prime minister is rather cosmetic. You have to change the policies. And here I think one of the failures really is not to establish the rule of law to ensure that foreign companies will come and invest in China. Despite the sanctions, there are still opportunities in the non-energy sector for companies to come, and it's quite a lucrative market there. But in the absence of the rule of law, the problem is that the state can simply take away your assets very quickly, and we've seen this happen time and time again. So it's a very difficult climate for foreign investors to actually get involved in.
Fraser, one more question about the issue of corruption. Now, the Yeltsin administration took much of the blame for rampant corruption. However, despite the high-handed crackdown upon oligarchs since Putin took office 20 years ago, do you see any improvement about the issue of corruption. Is President Putin able to enjoy a clean government?
Not at all. I mean, if you look at the number of Russians who allegedly have been working for state salaries, including the new Prime Minister, they all have properties abroad in London or Paris. They have all the foreign bank accounts. They all send their children to school, university in the UK and elsewhere. So, I mean, corruption has certainly not been stamped out, and this is obviously evident to the vast majority of the population. They were ready to accept this as long as their own standard of living steadily increased, but in a time when their own incomes do not increase, then more and more people are questioning where on earth did these cronies of Putin actually get their money from, and what are they doing for it?
Thank you very much. Anna, what do you think are the fundamental structural problems that are considered the fundamental challenges to the Russian economy? So long as I'm concerned, Medvedev, when he was the president of the Russian Federation, as part of the rotating power structure and the game, did call for modernization of the Russian economy, but he failed. And former President Barack Obama tried in vain to adopt the reset policy about Russia, part of which I'm afraid also referred to how to help modernize the Russian economy. He failed on multiple fronts. So what do you think of the reasons behind the underperformance of the Russian economy?
Well, I'm going to agree with Fraser Cameron on this. It's really about trust. Are you going to invest and create a business if you think that it can be taken from you, or that the laws will be arbitrarily enforced such to give your competitor the business? That it's about who you know, not what you know and what you can do. You cannot build an economy on that basis. So that will continue to be the struggle. But I want to emphasize something. You know, when people look back at history, they'll see that Putin resurrected Russia as a political force. But the economics is still out there. And one of the reasons is he used his, the money from his resources, unfortunately, to engage more in creating a Russian presence in terms of military, and also in terms of Syria and the Middle East, establishing bases and things like that, instead of putting it perhaps back into his own economy and making sure that there was this trust rebuilt.
Is that a serious effort of winning heart and mind of the electorate so that he could maintain a steady approval rating of at least 60%, and the height could be 80%?
Yeah, but Pavel has it directly on the head. There's a certain tolerance for corruption as long as everything is going along okay. But the moment people's salaries start to go down and they see these oligarchs and their yachts with their beautiful girls and their sports cars and all this type of stuff, then all of a sudden you're going to have real unrest. And we were witnessing it, and that's what Putin is reacting to. He wants to change things up and see what to do. But in the end, if you don't build that trust where people feel that there's a future, it's going to be very difficult.
Pavel, despite of old issues like resource curse, corruption and economic sanctions since Crimea, what do you think of the decline in birth rate? Because President Putin did speak of this issue in his presentation to the Russian Duma, the State Duma. How serious is or are the changes in demographic map of Russia?
Well, the declining birth rate, the demographic crisis, it began again a long time ago in Soviet times during the Cold War, and has been inherited by Russia, and this has been seen as a serious problem. It was addressed in the beginning of President Putin's rule. There were different money stimulus given to mothers who have a second child. Actually the decrease in population, it stabilized the population, but now we're going into another time of crisis. It's clear that in the worst case scenario, in about 14 years, we'd lose about 14 million population decrease. That's seen by Putin as unacceptable, so he has declared a program of increased stimulus to hand out money to families, especially impoverished families with kids. And this is going to help, of course, also increase the spending capability of the population, which could help with economic growth, and it may decrease poverty to some extent and social inequality. So this is killing a lot of birds with one stone. There's going to be a rather substantial increase in the social spending, and it's important from the point of view of Putin, who has always been a financial purist, to see that this does not lead to runaway deficits in the Russian financial system, especially because of sanctions. Russia cannot borrow much abroad today. And that means that's why he brings in a taxman as prime minister, who will see that it's important that the budget continues to be balanced. Will this actually really change the demographic situation is another question, but it's sure that this is going to be one of the very serious priorities. Putin doesn't see Russia as a great power without a growing or at least stable population.
Fraser, we saw frequent reshuffles of the cabinet, particularly replacement of the Russian prime ministers during the Yeltsin years. How long do you think this man, Mikhail Mishustin, would likely to stay on in his office as the new prime minister? Will he make a big difference given his track record and the trajectory, or you would see more of the unpredictability concerning stability of the new cabinet?
It's difficult to know because much will depend on the record over the next couple of years. I mean, he's in the obvious position to be the scapegoat. If things don't improve, then Putin can say it's his fault and get rid of him. If he manages to be successful, then how much credit will Putin give him? It's difficult to see. He's pretty unknown at the moment. But I think it's always going to be difficult for anybody in that position to try and create their own sort of power center separate from Putin, because everybody knows that regardless of who is prime minister, it's Putin who calls the shots, whether it's on taxation, whether it's trying to reverse a demographic trend, and of course in foreign policy it's Mr. Putin who really is the #1 politician.
Anna, a strong man, a strong president would always choose to pick a weak assistant, like a weak prime minister. Is that the case with Mr. Vladimir Putin?
Well, if you take a look at the track record, I think you'd have to agree with that. I mean, Medvedev never made any bones about when he was president, about who was really in power and in charge. And I don't think this gentleman has, Mikhail will have the standing to challenge in any way anything that Putin has done. So, as I said, the real question to me is, why is he suggesting a lot of these changes to the way, to the powers, how the powers are divvied up between the president and the prime minister, in essence giving the prime minister, in theory, more play in terms of what they do. And the only thing I can come to is that he would like to stay on in a revamped position as president, saying, I don't have all the power, I'm a caretaker. Because the difficulty with Putin is that he's made a tremendous amount of enemies. And the difficulty is, how do you find somebody, as he did for Yeltsin, to basically protect his back?
Pavel, how far is Russia away from taking part of the center stage of a digital leadership or digital technology? Because this is an age of digital technology, and China seeks to maintain our kind of a leadership, to have a corner overtaking, so to speak, because look at the boom of e-commerce, big data, and whatever smart in our markets. It seems Russia is way, way behind this trendy kind of dynamics in the age of industrialization 4.0 or industrialization of the internet. What can you tell us about your readiness to catch up and to use digital technology so that you would bypass this old traditional pattern of relying on resources in the real economy? What can you do in this particular area?
Well, it's being recognized as a problem. There is a program of digitalizing government and promoting the digital economy, and the new Prime Minister Mishustin and his work as chief of the tax service also did stuff to digitalize the tax service. So that will be addressed and is being addressed. Of course, of course, the problem is that Russia has computer specialists of good standing, but the hardware is all imported, and most important from China, from other places, and a lot of the software is also imported. And Russia, of course, does not have the capability to become a kind of leading digital superpower in the world stage, because it's buying stuff from different places. The best we can hope for is to do more digitalizing here at home, in the economy, and the way government is run. Of course, again, I mean, digitalizing in itself does not beat inefficiency or corruption. It's ways of doing things, but it doesn't change the essence of the Russian system of governing, which has, of course, its pluses, but it has a lot of deficiencies and obvious deficiencies. And that's what should be also addressed, not just how the business itself is run through a computer or not. And of course, the problem also is that President Putin himself does not actually use computers at all, and does not fully understand the new age of internet and computers.
Fraser, is it true that the Russian government has adopted an entirely different alternative cyber network to replace their reliance on Microsoft, Intel, so on and so forth? At the same time, look at their neighboring country of China, where we already started talking about the importance of 5G, AI, and big data. How big is the gap between Russia and China? In what particular areas do you think the new Prime Minister of Russia would roll out new measures to show up their economic performance?
Well, Russia has some extraordinary capabilities in cyber attack. Whether they're using these capabilities also to develop 5G, I rather doubt. I mean, everyone knows that Huawei, for example, is at least 2 years ahead of Nokia and Ericsson in Europe, or Samsung in Korea. So I think the gap with Russia is probably at least as big. So is the market big enough? Does Russia have the capabilities? I think these are unknowns. But I think that, you know, Russia has a very strong tradition in mathematics and computers. Unfortunately, some of the best and brightest of these brains have actually gone abroad to work for banks and for consultancies and for Microsoft probably, and Silicon Valley and London, Frankfurt, etc. So to what extent they've got a strong capability at home to actually develop a kind of 5G rival to Huawei, I really don't know.
Very quickly, Pavel, I'd like to go back to you about the issue of amending the Constitution. Is President Putin very, very serious about the amendments, about the new balance between the legislature, the executive branch, and the judiciary? What does he want to achieve through amending the Constitution?
Well, President Putin was very kind of precise. He said that these are important changes, but they're not overwhelming. The basics of the constitutions are not being changed, and actually they cannot be changed. The first two big parts of the Constitution are basically unchangeable. For that, you need the Constitutional Assembly, and you can't have a Constitutional Assembly in Russia because legislation to call up such an assembly is non-existent. So there will be some changes. On the face of it, it will give more power, sort of, to Parliament. That Parliament will approve not only the Prime Minister, but also his deputies and cabinet ministers. At the same time, the Kremlin retains the right to fire any minister that's been approved without parliamentary approval. And what's more important, Parliament is controlled by the Kremlin absolutely. The ruling United Russia Party has a total majority, and that means their right to kind of approve ministers is theoretical, because anyway the ministers come from the Kremlin and are approved by the Kremlin, and the Parliament is essentially a rubber stamp. So this does not really change that much in practice. Though it changes some, at least it gives, for Putin, the most important thing is unifying Russia socially and politically, and giving it, decreasing economic and social tensions in the face of a confrontation with the West. And these moves he's making are basically aimed at unifying the country, and that there be less political disagreement, and all parties will have a kind of say. So uniting Russia is the main objective of these means, what he's right now doing.
Fraser, we've seen some pockets of demonstrations in some parts of Russia over the issue of corruption. However, social cohesion has somehow been reinformed by very skillful and successful implementation of some of the foreign policy measures, such as the Russian backing of President Assad in Syria, particularly the recent campaign in Libya, despite the recent failures and setbacks in putting the two sides together for a diplomatic solution about the future of Libya. What do you think of the diplomacy of Russia in the new era?
Well, Russia has played Putin has played a relatively weak hand quite skillfully in the areas that you mentioned, but I'm not sure what real advantages it brings to the Russian population. And this, I think, is where, if you like, Putin's Achilles heel is. He has got to satisfy the domestic constituency, and that's why I think the changes we just talked about are important. He's trying to shake up the government, but everyone knows he still controls the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branches of government. So it's giving the appearance of a new face. And foreign policy plays into this, because he's trying to convince a majority of Russians that he's the one who can actually expand Russia's influence. But unless that influence leads to greater stability, greater incomes amongst the ordinary people, more job opportunities, I'm not sure it's really going to bring him very much success in the medium term.
Thank you very much. And very quickly, do you think President Putin has been able to build the image of major power despite sharp decline in its real comprehensive competitiveness in the wake of the Cold War in areas such as Syria and Libya? Russia is, after all, one of the P5 of the UN Security Council. What do you think of its diplomatic tactics?
Well, obviously, he's been able to outfox the United States. He's beaten us in a number of areas, the ones you just mentioned. And he continues to be an even larger force, even though his total economy is less than the state of California. So, yes, he's played a weak hand very well, as Cameron said, and he will continue to do that because it's a strong suit. The question is what happens to the economics.
Yeah. Bread and butter economics back at home would fundamentally be the real issue for the future of the presidency of Putin and perhaps the future of the Russian Federation. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.